Hello and welcome dear viewers. I'm Farah Atoui and you're watching Cases on Al-Ittijah TV channel. Article 26 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and Article 200 and Article 13 of the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights speaks about the laws that gives full rights to individuals to seek education. Through such articles, countries who are signatories and ratifiers should abide by the law in providing decent public schools. They are obliged to develop secondary education accessible to all, to develop equitable access to higher education, and to rule out discrimination at all levels of the educational system. But if that's the law, then why do we still have 121 million uneducated children around the world? If these countries ratify the law, then what is stopping them from implementing it? In today's episode, we will shed the light on the importance of education in building world peace. What are the programs and frameworks that various NGOs around the world are following in addressing education and social cohesion? How is lack of education controlling conflicts in various countries in the Middle East? Are world powers doing enough to tackle the issue? Joining us in the studio is Mr. John Paul Chami, a peace-building consultant and trainer, and through Skype from Lattakia is Aliaa Mahfouz, a professor assistant. Hello and welcome to Cases.
Hello.
A brief report, of course, and we will be right back.
Although the world has made significant improvements in the areas of basic school enrollment, countries in both first and third worlds go through various difficulties in the field of accessing schools and universities. The right to education becomes an international and indispensable right on the international platform. In this regard, Article 13 of the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights stated, "The states parties to the present covenant recognize the right to everyone to education. They agree that education shall be directed to the full development of the human personality and the sense of its dignity, and shall strengthen the respect for human rights and fundamental freedoms." Moreover, the covenant added that primary education shall be compulsory and available free to all, and that secondary education in its different forms, including technical and vocational secondary education, shall be made generally available and accessible to all by every appropriate means, and in particular by the progressive introduction of free education. As the International Covenant links education to human dignity and development and to the strength of the respect of human rights, education plays a noteworthy role in peace building and in conflict resolution. Nevertheless, the numbers revealed by both international governmental and non-governmental organizations are shocking. Over 121 million children around the world, with its majority in Africa, deprive education. It is obvious that the international community remains silent before the dreadful situation. Is the situation in this sense limited to undeveloped countries? On the other hand, how can education serve in building peace? And what are the obstacles struggling with a safe access to education?
Actually, Mr. John, education today is looked at as a link between development and human dignity, and as the report actually implies, it plays a pivotal role in actually giving conflict resolutions and also in improving living conditions of people, and also in addition to various factors that we will be discussing, also peace building, a very major point that is highlighted. Today, what's the importance of education amid all these conflicts that we are living today in this era?
I think this is a wonderful question, but I think behind every wonderful question there are also interesting questions to ask.
Yes.
Perhaps for me the interesting bit is what type and what is the actual quality of education that we are looking for as well. On several occasions, of course, education comes as one of the key elements in addressing several dimensions, be it economic, social, political, and so on and so forth. But I think for me the key question remains what type of education and what type of delivery means are the most suitable and adequate to today's world.
How do you evaluate the access to education in the Middle East specifically, of course, because I know that you're working closely on that. How do you evaluate? Do we have tremendous number of uneducated people in the Middle East?
Again, putting the stats aside, I would also try to highlight, and based on my very modest experience working both in Lebanon and in several countries in the Middle East region, it all trickles down for me to the quality of the education. And I'm not only referring to the quality of such topics as perhaps math or sciences and literature and so on, because these are also key and very important subjects. I would always refer and highlight the how, how are these topics being translated and conveyed to the, to our young generations. And one of the elements is that it is always said that in many cases we end up learning less by what we hear, but more by how we are being taught. And I think one of the key elements and one of the key messages that I would like to be highlighting in our conversation today is what is being used today as pedagogical tools and pedagogical technologies to convey these messages to our young and future leaders in the Arab world.
Okay. Of course, Aliaa Mahfouz, Ali, professor assistant, and joining us from Lattakia, from Syria specifically. Aliaa, how do you view the level of education inside Syria?
Well, thank you for having me at first. Well, the level of education in Syria, Syria now is you have two stages in Syria: Syria before the war and Syria in the midst of the war. Syria before the war was one of very few countries in the region that provided free learning, free public schools and public universities. And there were many laws enforcing education for people until they are 15 and sometimes until they are 18. And they opened lots of universities and lots of schools that teach people of that ages. And there are some punishments in the rules and in the constitutions for people who are not sending their children to school. So that was the case before. And the Syrian government achieved lots of major achievements in the education domain. For example, Tartus province, it's a coastal province, was declared in 2010 as free of illiteracy, completely 100% free of illiteracy, which was a major achievement. And they depended on surveys, of course, and special studies in doing this. And the Syrian government as well, grants lots of scholarships to, top students to study abroad in order to come. And
it also facilitated the way in front of foreigners to also have access to certain education inside Syria. Is that true?
Yes, we have we have the Language Institute in Damascus and in other provinces. They have lots of foreigners studying Arabic or studying the Oriental culture of Syria and the region. So they opened the cultures, and they had some mutual benefits. We have your experts, your expertise, and we give you our sources.
Okay.
I myself was granted a scholarship to study in England, and I was one of hundreds in England itself, and one of thousands in all parts of the world who were granted scholarship. And yes.
So of course here, so that therefore we can actually say that Syria used, of course we're speaking about Syria before the war, and that's of course a point that we have to actually focus on, because things are not the way that they should be right now. Does that mean that the Syrian government actually had in mind that there should be a straight and an official framework and a plan to work on in order to increase the level of educated people inside Syria? That's the aim and that's the target. Okay, what kind of plans and what kind of framework did the Syrian government actually use in implementing these laws and these rules?
First there were some laws to implement, you have all your children should go to school, and and universities is almost free. I studied for $60 for 4 years, which is something really great.
Exactly.
And the question, Mr. Chami was asking about how or the pedagogical ways in pedagogical methods in teaching. Yes, there was in the last 2008 and 2010. They kind of applied some, more improved pedagogical methods in schools, and they've tried it on a few schools, and to see the results of these pedagogical methods in order to spread it all over other schools. So they've changed all the course materials. They tried the Syrian government, along with lots of international institutes,
yes,
when it comes to all subjects, school subjects. So they've changed the course materials, they've changed the books. They tried to use more visual and more audio methods in teaching, especially when it comes to languages, and more field work when it comes to science. So they've tried this in very few schools, and then they started spreading it in more schools all over the country. But the war kind of stopped this plan.
Okay, so of course, Mr. John Paul, actually Aliaa pictured a very sophisticated and a very important and detailed image of the tools that were used in Syria in order to implement education. Is that the image that is seen along the Middle East, or in Syria rather than any other country along the Middle East?
I think we are still at the level of having such attempts, and again, I think we've been seeing a lot of piloting of such initiatives.
Yes,
as was earlier mentioned, and in Lebanon, basically we've had a lot of social, civil society activists and organizations trying to lead the role of experimenting, basically, and leading through introducing different types of material, or at least different types of delivery. It's not only about using the multimedia, it's also about how do you deliver them as well, because eventually you're sending a lot of implicit messages as well in how you're managing the classroom, for example.
But Mr. John, actually here to ask, why do we always have the impression that the Syrian government, actually one of the, out of the rest of the Middle Eastern countries, kept all its focus on education, and as she said, Aliaa, she only paid like $60 throughout the 4 years of education and university. I mean, we don't see that in other countries, in other Middle Eastern countries, if we can say. Does that mean that the Syrian government actually focused on that target because it knew what would that result of eventually?
Well, I mean, I might
or Lebanon is on that track.
Exactly. Well, I mean, I might not actually be the right reference to to forward this question to you. But what I would actually try and say is, it's not, well, having access to education, for all is important. But what's also equally important is, again, the quality of education that we are having. Again, I am not the right reference at this stage to run a comparative study as well. But what I would try and say is that, again, every context, every country in the Arab world has its own constraints and has its own strategic...
speaking of Lebanon, because of course you're directly in contact with the Lebanese people, what kind of initiatives is the government actually doing in helping or in actually increasing the number of educated people in a society?
Well, again, numbers aside, Lebanon has always been known within the actual, region, about the quality of the education that its schools are capable of delivering. However, mostly we're talking about private schools and privatized schooling systems, which are usually quite expensive. But however, when it comes to the public schools in Lebanon, I think there have been a lot of improvement. The curriculum has been revamped over and over again.
They came to realize the importance of that probably at one point or another.
And I would also try and also pinch, well, the importance of what has been done by local civil society organizations in Lebanon, trying to brew some of those, attempts and trying to also inspire the Lebanese Ministry of Education, which I know that it has been very much responsive and very much positive in trying to embrace and to take in some of the policy-related suggestions and the improvements that were actually provided by the NGOs in Lebanon, specifically on the following question of what type of education could be conducive to to peace building or to the creation of what is usually termed peaceable human beings in a country that
so actually
knows
we can say
wars.
As a peace builder and a consultant and a trainer on these issues, you've actually detected some kind of reform or even some kind of an improvement when it comes to understanding the importance of education in a society.
I would
okay.
Yes, I would agree to
Mr. John,
this,
can
yes.
we link that to actually international laws that obliges countries who are ratifying and countries who are signatories of these conventions? Is it due to that law that has been signed and that's internationally written? And that's why I've seen countries kind of applying reforms or even being on the right track when it comes to giving free education.
Well, I mean, yes. I mean, namely,
is that forcing them in one way or another?
Forcing them, gently inspiring them as well. I mean, of course, such international standards and norms, they are there not to actually force, countries to behave in a certain way, but they're actually more to provide a certain level of standardization when it comes to education, since this is our topic today. They're very, very much important because at some point, whether countries like it or not, they have to follow a certain trend. And one of the major questions to ask is how are things going to look like? What is life going to look like 20 and 30 and 40 years from now, so that we prepare our generations to be able to, adapt accordingly.
Of course, we'll be speaking in depth about that point specifically, but first we need to take a short break, and be right back. Dear viewers, stay tuned.
Pollution and climate change, medicine manipulation, genetically modified food, the destruction of wildlife, and corporate exploitation. These are all part of a new terrorism threatening our future.
Eco-terrorism, global awakening to a world under threat.
Dear viewers, welcome back. Issues organization, 121 million children around the world are out of education. According to Federal Ministry for Economic Cooperation and Development, 1 in 3 children in Africa that are enrolled in school drop out of primary education. Save the Children Aid Agency highlighted more than a fifth of the Syria schools have been destroyed or made unusable in more than 2 years of conflict, jeopardizing the education of 2.5 million young people. And of course, from this point, we move to Aliaa to actually ask about the consequences, of course, and how this tragedy that actually, and the conflict and the stalemate that Syria is facing, affecting the students, affecting the quality of education that the government stayed for a very long time building and making sure that it's acquiring. And of course, we highlighted some points that you would like to comment also on.
Well, yes, now the situation is like a major challenge in all domains, but I think it's a major challenge in the education domain for the ministries of education. Now, like hundreds and thousands of schools have turned into shelters to refugees, people who ran away from hotspot areas to relatively safer areas like in Aleppo and Damascus, and even here in Lattakia. We have lots of schools that turned into shelters to, for these people. So school starts after exactly 2 weeks from now. And this is a challenge as well for officials in these ministries, how to open these schools. And we have that number, like 1.5 million refugee in Lattakia alone. And that one point. The other point, lots of universities, private universities, and even like I am supposed to teach in Aleppo University, but I can't go to Aleppo now because it's a very hotspot area. Plus, there's no, there's no road to Aleppo to arrive to Aleppo. So, which means like so many students are not able to go to university or are not able to go to schools.
Yes.
That's for one point. And the other point is turning into shelters. And like we had the high school exams and the middle school exams, which is supposed to be only once a year and only for one time. And because of the situation, many opposition-controlled areas have prevented people from submitting their exams for their reasons. So they have, the ministry had to repeat the exam, to run it over and over, trying to tackle as much as they can, as many as they can of students to sit for exams. So that was that created some sort of chaos in assessing people's students' achievement and their grades. So that's a major challenge for the Ministry of Education, whether be it the schools or universities, because so many universities are now closed because of
and most of them are used as shelters also, of course.
Shelters.
Joined by George Saliba, Human Resources Manager at Teach for Lebanon, joining us from Beirut. Hello and welcome, Mr. George.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you very much for joining us in Cases. Mr. George, if you can give us an idea, first of all, about the organization that you work for, Teach for Lebanon. What's its aims and targets?
Teach for Lebanon is a part of Teach for All. Teach for All is a global network of 29 national organizations working to expand the educational opportunities in countries. Teach for All was launched in 2007.
Yes.
And Teach for All provide direct services and foster a powerful network among its partners and the participants. Teach for Lebanon was established in 2008 by Mr. Ali Dimashqi, and Teach for Lebanon aims to eliminate educational inequality in Lebanon by fostering youth leadership and promoting civic engagement.
Mr. George, to what extent was the Teach for Lebanon organization inspired by the international or the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in Article of Core 26 and in Articles 213 and Article 13 in the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights? Because of course these are international laws that obliges countries, or of course forces countries, to provide free education to its citizens. To what extent was the organization that you work for inspired or even abided by these laws implemented in the conventions?
Definitely we work with other NGOs to the same target, which is to eliminate the educational inequality in the whole world.
Okay.
And the Teach for Lebanon model is working on within the Lebanese context.
Okay, definitely. Of course, we're joined here by John Paul Chami, who is a peace building and a consultant and also a trainer. Do you have any access, or are you also linking these kind of qualities and these kind of characteristics within the institution itself? Are you asking for the help of these consultants, of course, in order to have a sufficient collaboration between you two?
I met JP Chami in June, and JP Chami was one of the trainers that helped us train our new cohort in the Summer Institute, and he gave a lecture on writing lesson plans.
Okay, great. So these, of course, were great collaborations between you and Teach for Lebanon, Mr. John. What was the result of this kind of collaboration here, Mr. George?
Definitely a positive impact came, and the feedback of the fellows was really positive. The session was very interesting, and they said that they learned a lot from this.
I understood, of course, that you're also working on rural areas specifically inside Lebanon.
Definitely.
Okay, so it's that giving any kind of sufficient results? And what are the kind of difficulties are you facing in trying to implement free education in the rural areas specifically?
Definitely,
people are
the
accepting
official
it?
figures in Lebanon show that although 3/4 of the Lebanese students are enrolled in the 9th grade,
Yes.
only around 49% of those students successfully complete the secondary cycle. We face a lot of obstacles and challenges in rural areas.
Yes.
However, our fellows are trying to create a change in the educational system and to improve the quality of education in the rural areas and to reduce the gap between the cities and the rural areas.
Mm-hmm. Okay, excellent. Of course, Mr. John, George is giving a bright idea of the kind of actions that are taken on the ground, of course, here concerning Lebanon. He's saying that there is a previous collaboration between you two. Can you tell us more about how important is it for the organization today to work hand in hand with consultants and trainers in order to submit a sufficient material or, of course, raise awareness in rural areas specifically when it comes to the importance of education?
Absolutely. Now, we are on the search of something here.
Okay.
We're looking for...
Of course, yeah, you're working with various organizations, I see.
Of course.
Okay.
Now, the thing is that we are looking, again, for the type of this holistic pedagogical, approach and this education that is value-laden, that can not only target, how, what our youngsters know, but also how, what type of usage they will be, putting it into.
Okay.
Now, of course, there are many opportunities and there are many, many challenges, obviously. The main challenge, I think, is trying to involve everyone that has to do with education. And today's holistic educational approaches would actually need to involve really everyone. Everyone, the students, the parents, the teachers, the school administrators, but definitely there's a major gap, which is also trying to link up all this to what is happening within the ministries of education as well, in order to build the right policies that can support such types of education.
Yes, and of course you need funding here, so therefore the funding is a very important task that should be actually given by the government, so for sure, or by NGOs or like any kind of donors, let me say.
Well, I mean, the initiatives that I am personally involved in, they've mainly been funded by international organizations, international donors and governments and embassies here in Lebanon, because I think there has been a major wave and a major interest by such agencies in the development of an education that not only develops the capacities and the technologies, but also answers a main question.
Great, we will be speaking, yes please.
Which is how can education cater for some of the war-related matters that happened in the past, but can education set us free from this vicious loop of conflicts that we are entangled in?
Of course, we will be speaking more about the quality of education submitted, the one that you highlighted. Aliaa, of course, we said that from the beginning of the episode that there are certain laws and articles, whether in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights or even in the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights here. Can I say that the Syrian government today, due to such laws, because it was forced at one point or another, if it's ratifying these laws, can we say because of these kind of norms, they are implementing and they are giving so much attention to educational technique inside Syria, or it has nothing to do with that and it's out of national, in order to protect their national security and cause development inside Syria?
Well, it can go both ways.
Yes.
Like you have international law, and you are a country of the international community, so you have to abide by the laws.
Okay.
And you have like education frames the nationality, the personality of the nation, or the personality of people who are going to build the nation, the children and the students. So which means like you care for your society and for your nation, and at the same time you abide by the rules.
Okay.
But like now, and we have now another challenge. Mr. Chami was talking about the vicious cycle of war. Now we're still living amidst this, barbaric war on my country, and so I think that the education system in the future, when the war ends, has major challenges in erasing this era of suffering and bloodshed.
Okay.
In erasing this era and trying to pave the way for a more flourish future and a more peaceful accepting of the other.
Of course, Ali, if you want to speak about the connection of war and education, here I do remember Dr. Ahmed Badruddin Hassoun, who's the Grand Mufti of Syria. He actually highlighted on his last speech to the Arab writers how through their writings they can help prevent conflict and contribute to long-term peace. Of course, stating that those engaged into the war are uneducated and needed guidance at one point or another. Because they lack the necessary education, they join these takfiri groups and the terrorist organizations.
Exactly.
How important are these words today, Aliaa, amid all these conflicts that you are passing through?
Yeah,
your country
exactly. What the Grand Mufti said is a fact, actually. Huge number of uneducated people, and they are uneducated because they are in, the far countrysides.
Rural areas.
Yes, rural areas. And that was one reason why they're not uneducated. And they were influenced by a deformed version of religious education.
Yes.
Which is, to state it clearly, is like the Wahhabi version of Islam. And this kind of, if you call it education or something, this kind of education have led that these people are the fuel of the war.
Yes.
So they die in hundreds and in thousands because they think that they're going to heaven now, and that's what they've been taught, basically. So working on this, working on curriculum in schools and universities, side by side by what the mosques and religious institutes are teaching, I think both sides should work on this to clear the picture.
As we can see and understand, Mr. John, of course, Aliaa highlighted 2 points. She spoke about these rural areas that they not have access to, and of course, lack of education led them to what happened today, and led them to actually join these terrorist organizations. Of course, number 2, a very important point, she spoke about the quality of education. Of course, these kind of people or citizens living in the rural areas, they are educated, but they are gaining or having the wrong education. And that brings us back to the point that you were speaking about, the quality that should be given, or the quality of education that should be submitted to these people. Of course, here is that a point that you're always keeping in mind when training and actually advising people of how to seek a good education.
Well, I mean, of course. However, highly educated people can still resort to violence as well.
But the percentage is different, though. The percentage is not that high, let me say.
I mean, I think it goes without saying that somebody with almost no education at all in today's world might probably have a lot of problems finding an actual job, and without security, without food and securing a job, and this can easily lure a lot of people to finding this security somewhere else, of course, under different slogans and maybe a different set of values as well. So what I would say is that yes, it's a definite answer that in today's world, uneducated people are very much vulnerable to being attracted by several other slogans, some of which would actually, unfortunately, of course, include the resorting to values that are by no means endorsed by peace.
Of course, here again, we are speaking from the perspective that how education helps in peace building. The more the educated society we have, the more peace that we can submit to this world. You will take a final break and be right back. Dear viewers, stay with us.
The crisis of capitalism, the European impasse, the energy shortages, the emerging power of Asia, the economic power of the Arab world, the economic debate, informative, revealing, and progressive. It discusses the economic event of the world.
Economic debate, where the numbers reveal the truth.
Dear viewers, welcome back. Dr. John, actually UNESCO and UNICEF had intensive programs not only to educate people but to prevent conflict through education. For example, the framework that happens in Sri Lanka and Cambodia. What do you know about these programs in general, not necessarily the programs used in these countries that I highlighted? In general, what kind of programs do they use, and were they sufficient, of course, when it comes to application? When it comes to applying them, were they sufficient? Well,
I mean, these programs are, of course, very much needed. Strategically speaking, they're very, very important. They always, look towards the very much longer term, of course. So it's very much tricky and very much hard to assess the impact of such programs. However, they are a very important, argument in favor of, many other smaller initiatives that get to be funded and that they get to be, supported by several international agencies again. So again, without these frameworks, again, you have the international standards, then you have those frameworks that eventually, promote and get the interest of the needed financing, so that eventually we get to see some of these initiatives trickling down to schools, to local neighborhoods, and to the type of work that is being done, for example, again, in my country, in Lebanon, on the level of civil society.
And what kind of problems does these NGOs have to face, or even obstacles, when trying to implement these frameworks and programs that you've highlighted in rural areas? Do people immediately accept them? Do people immediately accept to actually collaborate with these organizations?
Well, I mean, there's a huge,
or they also
spectrum.
Again ask for your help to actually interfere as a consultant?
Well, again, this is, I think we can talk, forever about this. Of course, not all communities are going to open up. It will depend on who is the implementer and the actual time.
And ways of implementing also?
The ways will definitely, affect that. The actual time frame of the actual project as well. Like a small initiative of 2 to 3 months is very much going to be different than if you have 2 to 4 years, for example, to implement a certain initiative. Most importantly is, again, the how. For example, some of these programs are about, instilling peace education into either the curriculum or into the daily practices of our teachers today. So in many cases, what happens is that we get stuck on the theoretical level. And our teachers at some point would come and tell us, but, how do you really do it?
Yes.
You know what I mean? Because you can talk for theories for many, many days, but eventually, how do you do it? I could share, for example, one interesting opportunities that some Lebanese teachers, both in the public sector and in the private sector, got through an international organization called Search for Common Ground, for example. What they did in their office here in Lebanon, they brought us somebody from South Africa, a very interesting trainer, Valerie Dovey. She spent years developing her curriculum, and when she came to Lebanon, she spent a lot of time redeveloping again and tailoring the actual material so that it's actually suitable to how we perceive peace. And again, peace is a very big concept, and there are many, many values embedded within that small word. So eventually they ended up working on something very specific, which was listening skills and the joint problem-solving techniques.
Very nice.
It wasn't called solving.
Easy technique also, let me.
They were very, very easy with a lot of exercises,
and
highly
accepted
interactive.
by various ages also.
Well, yes, because eventually I think we are all interested in being able to listen better so that we speak better, so that we have a higher and better quality of living with our peers and families. But also when it comes to collective joint problem-solving, which is a highly important skill, especially in a country that usually Lebanese are to a certain extent labeled as being slightly individualistic when it comes to approaching a problem. So here it was a very, very much interesting skill that can actually foster positive, cooperative attitudes within our youngsters.
Amnesty International, Aliaa, actually spoke about the importance of education and went as far as speaking of various kind of education. One of it is the human rights education, rather than, of course, peace building. How important is that kind of education in your opinion, and was it tackled or was it kept in mind when implementing rules inside or when teaching students in universities and schools?
Well, as for human rights, it wasn't really officially tackled by the curriculum, but there were many active NGOs working on these issues And
UNESCO and UNICEF joined, actually. They also had something in Syria.
Actually, yes, they did. They had some sort of summer courses or some, like some workshops showing what is it, human rights, and how to deal with human rights for people who are interested. So people were not obliged to attend this kind of courses, but like the people who were interested in this topic, they enrolled in these scholarships. But I think like peacemaking and or peace studies and human rights should have a great space when the war ends. When the war ends in Syria, this kind of education and highlighting these topics, these two topics and more related topics, should be really highlighted and should be introduced to the Syrian society.
Okay. Mr. John, with all these improvements and with all these tactics and frameworks that are actually used, and you've highlighted, of course, some of the tools that were used by NGOs, by international NGOs, but over 121 million children around the world are still without education, and its majority is in Africa. Can we say that it's because the international community remains silent in front of such a dreadful situation, and that's why the number is still high?
Well,
I mean, with all these kind of ways that are used and the tools, but we still have a huge number. We're speaking about 121 million children.
Well, we have this huge number of children who don't have access to education, unfortunately. But at the same time, even worse than that, 30,000 children die on a daily basis due to poverty, due to famine, hunger, and most importantly, due to preventable diseases.
Okay.
And which means to a very big extent that, our world has not yet developed perhaps the international empathy needed to foster programs that will seriously try to address such unacceptable happenings in today's world. So I would say that, of course, education is key, definitely. In our business, in the business of training, we always say, instead of giving somebody a product, it's always better to work with that somebody so that that person is able to develop that product and produce it, and hence develop his or her, capacities to be liberated. And hence, this is something that was mentioned repeatedly by a very known pedagogue in the world by the name of Paulo Freire, who has actually worked on liberating, the liberating type of education, which actually aims at providing a higher level of critical thinking so that populations eventually, make up their minds about what they really want, and then slowly start moving forward towards achieving a higher level of life and a better quality of life.
Okay. We're joined now by Dr. Naziha Saleh, who's a sociologist. Hello and welcome to Cases, Doctor.
Thank you, thank you.
Doctor, what are the ways that actually you use personally in encouraging students to understand the importance of education, and how important is that factor not only for individuals or for personal means, but also for peace building?
First of all, the students, they should hard on themselves to reach a high level in education. If the situation in their countries are willing them to reach this high level of education, because as we know, not every country gives these opportunities for students, and there is no resources in all countries, so the students, they can reach it. But the students, they should make efforts by themselves to reach this level.
Okay. Actually, Dr. Naziha, there is an important point that you highlighted, speaking about the governments and how they actually implement rules or even encourage people and citizens to seek education. Groups and activists nowadays are in the struggle against the increasing commercialization of education and for free, of course, education around the world. Speaking, of course, here about these private schools who are increasing the salaries, who are increasing, of course, the money that should be paid by the students and by their own parents, and therefore minimizing the number of students who wants to seek education because of financial means. Of course, now we've seen strikes and struggles in order to minimize the number of that. How do you look at these cases? Doesn't the government here is supposed to actually impose certain laws that could keep these schools, of course, accessible to all people?
Yeah. As we know, the right of education was declared first in 1948. And most of the countries in the United Nations signed it. But not all of them applied it for many reasons, such as the colonialism or the mass dependence in many poor countries, and also the poverty. And since we link the education with development, so the development in any country in the world is scaled by education. However, we can see the score of education in each country from its development. But there is something here we should talk about, that the education is a political decision. This decision is not made by the same country which the non-educated people are living in. But sometimes it's made by the powerful countries which control the poor countries.
Even politics is involved in education.
Itself who decided. We have to see the political decision in this case here.
Okay, of course here, again, the same question goes to you, Mr. John. What can we say about these high fees that the private schools are actually asking the parents to actually pay? Aren't these kind of tactics also repelling mothers and fathers from sending their children to school? Of course, amid financial difficulties worldwide.
I mean, of course, but at the same time, this has also created some sort of a small disparity in levels in several contexts between the privatized schooling systems and the more public one. So there's some sort of built-in
but when
competition.
It comes also to public schools, they say that, well, the public school does not submit high education, a high standard of education. That's why they prefer the private. But meanwhile, the private also, the fees are becoming unbearable.
Of course, I mean, totally. I think that there must be some sort of a small tipping point eventually, that by which education, no matter what level it is reaching, should be acceptable and of quality. Again, education for all is a goal, but again, quality education for all should equally be stressed as well.
Yes, of course. Aliaa, what's the tools that the Syrian government is using nowadays in order to keep people educated?
Well, it is really difficult, but first can I add a point?
Yes,
Dr. Naziha was talking about politics. Of course, the political system of any country has a great role in the education system in the same country. Take for example, we have the subject, the national education subject in school. It was taught according to Hizb al-Ba'ath party for 40 years now.
Yes.
And then last year when there was a change in the constitution and Article 8 stating that the country is led by one party has changed or has dropped. They dropped this article, so accordingly they've changed the subject. So it became, instead of teaching anything related to this party, it started teaching about politics in general and patriotism and all this stuff.
Unfortunately, Aliaa, we're running out of time here.
Of course, Syria is trying, the Syrian government is trying really hard
amid all difficulties
to provide amid all these chaos and all this conflicted situation, trying to provide many schools, a number of schools, and trying to open logistic roads to
and at least provide protection to these students and all before seeking the right education.
They're trying really hard, but it's a challenge.
Okay, Mr. John, the last word for you here. What's the advice that you would like to give here? Of course, whether when it comes in the way of implementing education or even the tools used in implementing it.
Perhaps the advices, but I will be very, very short. Of course,
yes,
there are several, but maybe just to link them with what was said today. Aliaa did refer to something very, very important, which is education in a post-conflict, in a post-violent conflict case. Example Syria, example Lebanon as well. After the war, an important issue is perhaps instead of erasing you know, what happened and helping in soothing up what happened.
How the students integrate also
exactly,
in society.
But
again.
also remembering. But remembrance needs to be done in a very careful way. The collective memory is something very, very sensitive that needs to be properly managed, and things should not be, perhaps as we learned here in Lebanon, swept under the rug, but perhaps they need to be properly, you know, taken care of. And this would require a strategy. A country that comes out of a war will need several years, and we're talking 20, 30, even more years of strategically well-planned, you know, educational strategies, but also strategies on many other aspects
even though
as
it lasted years working on the educational technique inside Syria, but plus also war, unfortunately, brings us, takes us back. Dr. Naziha Saleh, Sociology, of course, we wanted a lot to speak about you, but speak to you, but unfortunately, we ran out of time. Thank you for joining us here in Cases. Aliaa Mahfouz, Ali, Professor Assistant, joining us from Lattakia, from Syria. Thank you. And of course, here, my thanks goes to Mr. John Paul Chami, Peace Building Consultant Trainer. Thank you very much for being with us in Cases.
Thank you.
Dear viewers, that's all the time that we have. Thank you for watching.